Hi everyone, it's Professor Trent with your Hume 115 Chapter 4 Lecture Summary. So we left off on Chapter 3, so please meet me on page 122 and 123. Just a quick review of major points from Chapter 3. We discussed ambiguity, vagueness, overgeneralizations, and why definitions are important. The overall takeaway of this chapter is this. We are all, from time to time, imprecise in our language. The goal is to be exact in our language. And one way to think about it is a surgeon's work is precise. It's exact. If you are having your appendix removed, you want your surgeon to be exacting. You want her to make a very precise incision at the point where she can successfully remove your appendix. So that's a good example of remembering exactly what exact and precise are and what the goals are. Now, the opposite of exact and precise is vague, ambiguous, and overgeneralization. So you can go back and review those definitions on 122 and 123. Definitions overall help us to be more exact in our language and therefore in our arguments. So moving along to Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is an excellent chapter. I'm really glad that you all have a chance to look at this. Let me get my exact page number for you. So we have Chapter 4. We are on page 143. So I'm going to flip over, as I always do, to our review session and our section and glossary. So in this chapter, on Chapter 4, we are learning how to evaluate information and judge credibility. This is a very important chapter. You're beginning to see how the tools are building upon themselves and how learning how to recognize arguments, evaluate arguments, ultimately leads in your ability to evaluate and judge information according to the evidence and credibility. So turn with me on page 172 and 173. So in this chapter, they do a great job of teaching you about the principle of charity, the principle of fidelity, when to question what you're hearing, when to give someone grace and charity in what you're hearing, how to seek out a second opinion, how to distinguish fake news from facts, how to distinguish misinformation from facts, and also looking at the objective truth. Again, seeking facts when and where you can. So your glossary terms for this chapter, there's not many of them, so I'd like for you to know all of them. Anecdote, credibility, fallacy of misplaced burden of truth, fake news, principle of fidelity, and principle of charity. Those are on page 173 for quick reference. Now let's go back to 144 and take a look at a summary of this chapter. So let's say you and your friend are in an argument, not a physical argument, but a critical thinking argument, and your friend offers a statement that is unusual. He or she offers a piece of evidence that is unusual. According to the principle of charity, see page 144, we are, rather than going into attack mode and that against that person's statement, it is a better role for us as critical thinkers to allow that person to think through their statement, maybe ask some follow-up questions, but to give that person what you know to be is the benefit of the doubt. It does not mean that you need to agree with their argument or completely buy into the statement. It's okay for you to ask questions. It's okay for you to ask for follow-up. But the idea is that if they make an unusual statement that you cannot verify in the moment, it is okay to give them a benefit of a doubt, and say, I've got to think about that, or I would like to go and look up what you're talking about, or I'd like to gather more information about what you're saying. It's okay to do that. That is called the principle of charity. Now, when you are representing their argument back to them or other people, it is your responsibility to practice the principle of fidelity, which means that you represent their argument or statement in the way it was represented to you. You don't commit a fallacy. We're going to see that in chapter 5, like a straw man fallacy of weakening their argument so that you can deconstruct it. Rather, you represent their argument or statement to the best of your ability. And that is called the principle of fidelity, preserving the intended meaning of your friend's statements and arguments when trying to interpret their statements and arguments. All right, friends. So let's go over to page 146, going back to the argument with you and your friend. Let's say your friend does make an unusual statement. Well, what do you do? All right, there's two things that you can do, digging into the specifics. Thinking about your background knowledge and the available evidence, all right, your background knowledge. So your friend makes a statement about something that you actually have a lot of background knowledge in. Let's say it's about college tuition costs, and it's about Wake Tech college tuition costs. And you happen to know a lot about that particular subject, but let's say your friend isn't a Wake Tech student, and they may not know as much as you do about tuition costs at Wake Tech. Well, in that case, you have quite a bit of background knowledge in that area. But let's say that they are making an argument about California community college costs. And let's say that you don't necessarily have a lot of background knowledge in community college costs in California. It is okay for you to extend the principle of charity, benefit of doubt, to them when you realize you don't necessarily have a lot of background knowledge in the moment to speak to their claim and statement. Also, looking at the available evidence. Let's say as they're presenting their argument to you about community college prices in California, they show you a spreadsheet or they show you the website of the college where they are attending that has the tuition breakdown. Well, in that case, you have evidence available. You can actually examine the evidence right then and there with your friend. But let's say you're not close to a computer, you're not close to a phone, and you are hearing that they are saying X is the amount per semester in California for this particular community college, all right? So you are relying on them to fulfill what's called the burden of proof in convincing you about this argument as to whether, let's say the issue is community college costs are higher in California or higher in North Carolina, or the value of the education received at a California community college is better or worse than one received in North Carolina. You have to rely on your background knowledge and the available evidence, and that is called when you are accepting or suspending belief on unusual statements. So let's take this argument a little bit further. Let's say you're hearing all the evidence about your friend's claim about community college costs in California, and you're considering the source's credibility. So right now, the source is your friend. Your friend is telling you all the statements about community college costs in California and the quality of education. You're relying on your friend as a source. But let's say later, you access sources about the actual community college's website, their tuition, what's included in their tuition. Would that be considered a good source or a not so good source? What do you think? Definitely a good source. So the community college website itself is considered a reliable source. Now, is there an inherent self-interest in the source? Perhaps, right? Because it is the community college's website. So might you get what's called a second opinion on college tuition costs in California? Of course. Could you find credible sources about college tuition costs in California and across the United States, in North Carolina? Absolutely. It would take a little bit of research. So in the moment with your friend, you are relying on what might be an anecdote, a story about community college costs, or you all might be looking at a website together. So when evaluating credibility, you are asking who's the source, right? Do they have a vested interest in this information? And can you seek out a second opinion verifying the statement that this source is providing? So the page numbers for the words that we just covered, the definitions, are page 150 through 153. Seeking a second opinion. Why is it important to seek a second opinion? Well, critical thinking is about a 360. We talked about this in chapters 1 and 2. Critical thinkers look at issues and topics from all points of view, not just one source, not just one anecdote, not just one website, not just one opinion, but a complete circle of all the various angles and opinions on any given issue. So seeking a second opinion helps you verify the story or the information. All right. Now, when someone says to you, trust me, I know it on good authority. Let's say it's your friend talking about tuition costs in California. Here are the questions that you should ask when someone says, trust me, I'm an authority on this subject matter. At the top of 156. Is this person's authority an actual authority on the particular subject? Would this person know if the authorities or other authorities disagreed on the subject? Can you trust the arguer to have quoted the authority or the expertise or the data correctly? And can you trust the source of the information to tell the truth, right? So those 4 questions are at the top of 156. All right, put a star by this section. So all of these sections are leading to something that's really important, especially this fall, getting solid information about whom to vote for. So this section covers a lot, including a term that we are all familiar with at this point, fake news. All right, so when it comes to political elections, whether it's on the town level, the city level, the state level, or the federal level, it's really important to gather reliable, credible information. And fake news is misinformation. Often comes to us through social media sites or via headlines that are salacious. And by salacious, I mean dramatic headlines. What we call in journalism, if it bleeds, it leads. Fake news can be perpetuated by people sharing links and headlines over and over and over on social media. A great example of this, a sort of funny example at this point, is that, Morgan Freeman has died 13 times already, right? And Morgan Freeman is always the first to post somewhere on his official sites and say, I haven't died, it's just another case of fake news. All right, so that's like the classic example. When you see a hashtag trending on Twitter and it's a celebrity's name, unless you click on the trending hashtag and figure out exactly what it is about the person that's trending, the first thought that people usually has is that the person has died, right? And so you don't want to perpetuate fake news. Instead, you want to click and go a little bit deeper, get a second opinion, look at the credibility of the source, and determine what is actually going on within the story. So when thinking about whom to vote for, your book does a great job of parsing out, of digging in all the ways in which you can evaluate candidates' platforms, their policies, what their views are on issues that are important to you, rather than looking at sort of 30-second sound bites, either of advertisements or little headlines on social media that scroll that are based on algorithms. So taking a deep dive when it comes to political voting. All right, factcheck.org is also another great website that a lot of folks use when researching papers or verifying news online, factcheck.org. Many mainstream newspapers also have their own fact-checking sections within online newspapers or media sites. So that's also important, fact-checking, to avoid fake news or misinformation. All right, so let's do a quick wrap up. All right, this chapter is about evaluating credibility and information. So knowing that a person's credibility is it's on a gamut, right? There's credibility to a degree. So you, as the critical thinker, have to determine where their credibility falls on that gamut. We talked about fake news, principle of fidelity, principle of charity, and then the fallacy of misplaced proof. When your friend says to you, well, you have to believe me because I'm giving you this argument, but they haven't yet proven to you the argument, that's a fallacy of misplaced burden of proof. They are expecting you to provide the evidence for the argument when we know thus far in our chapter reading that the burden of proof lies on the person making the argument. That's you as a critical thinker. You have the burden of proof to provide strong, cogent evidence for your argument. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. I will see you for the Chapter 5 summary. Have a great time reading and studying. Take good care.